from Canada. Thanks for dialing in. If you're in Toronto, a little bit after hours, thank you for dialing in. I see we've got some people here from New Zealand, plenty of Australians. Yeah, great to have you here. So I'll just start with a little bit of an introduction, and then we can kick off into the presentation. So those of you who don't know me, my name is Elissa Newall. I'm a partner here at Edified, and I run the Enquiry Experience Tracker work. If you don't know about Edified, so we're a consulting and research company. We work exclusively for the education sector, and most of us are here in Australia, but we have colleagues in Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, and we're really pleased to work with a global client base. So today we're going to have a presentation. I'm going to take you through the results of the global research that we've done this year. That's going to go for about half an hour. And then we're going to hear from one of the universities. We've got Sara from Western Sydney University. She's going to tell us a little bit about some of the work they've been doing around social media inquiries. And then we're going to have an opportunity for questions at the end. So if you have any questions or would like clarifications as we're going on, I ask if you could just use the chat function, and Shweta will be able to reply to any sort of simple questions on there. And if there's anything a bit hairy, we'll leave it till the end and talk about it together. And yeah, I think that's about it. So I'm going to crack into it. I'm going to share my screen and we'll take it away. Okay. So see if the screen actually works. There we go. So this year's Enquiry Experience Tracker, we had 128 institutions from 11 countries. And as you should all know, we've been mystery shopping these institutions with our prospective student mystery shoppers. And then we assess those results and we compare how everyone's gone. And by now you've gotten your own institution reports. Hopefully you've been having a look through those. This report today is a summary of the global insights across those 128 institutions. So the EET was developed by us in partnership with UniQuest. UniQuest is a outsourcing provider. They're based in the UK, and they work with a lot of universities as their inquiry team or conversion team. And they've provided us a lot of great data and insights each year that help to shape the focus and the criteria that we use in assessing the inquiries. Little shout out to our team. As you'll spot in there, some of the friendly faces of our mystery shoppers, but also our consultants and data people and everyone who works together to bring the project together. Before I jump into the results, I'll just make sure we're all really clear on how it works. This is, I guess, important if it's your first year in the study and you're sitting there as well with a report and wondering what some of it means. So just here's a little map with the sample of who's been involved. It's been a really good sample this year. So about half of the Australian and New Zealand universities, about a third of the UK universities, and a really good kind of contingent from Canada, mostly concentrated in British Columbia and Ontario. Had a little smattering around Ireland, Europe, and the Middle East. And because there's only a small number in those, we've clubbed them together to create a region. So when we're doing our regional benchmarks, those three areas, mainland Europe, Ireland, and Middle East, are clubbed together. We had a number of different personas, so different types of students who were represented in the mystery shopping. Not every institution got an inquiry from every one of these student types. Some in the UK had UK domestic inquiries. Some in Australia, we had an Indonesian persona that was particularly for Australians. So the New Zealand and Canadian also had some differences. They were agreed with different groups of people, but all in all, we've got a spread of students representing a little bit of undergraduate, a bit of postgraduate, some of those main recruitment markets, plus a couple of newer or different ones. And we're looking at a wide range of inquiry channels. So traditional channels, email, web form, live chat, you could say, and then some of those ones that are starting to be more common, well, Instagram is incredibly important, but starting to really be seen as part of the inquiry team's role in some institutions, peer-to-peer. And we also looked this year at partner websites. So things like Find a Master's or Study in Australia, Study in New Zealand, those types of websites that students can inquire on. So those were the channels that we looked at. The mystery shopping happened between April and June. And then we've spent the last, couple of months assessing and scoring and pulling together all the reporting. The inquiries, once they're placed by the students, we score them against this model. And those of you who are familiar with this from last year, there were a couple of tiny changes. We have a criteria around inquiry channels. So 10% of the score relates to how easy it was for students to find the inquiry channels on your website and find the correct ones. 20% of the score relates to the level of responsiveness, so how fast the institutions were to reply to the inquiries. 40% of the score, last year it was 50%, this year it's 40%, relates to the quality of the communication. So we're really looking into the nitty-gritty of what was sent. So what was the tone? How clear was it? Was it persuasive? Was it mobile responsive? Did it answer all the questions? Was it relevant and tailored to the particular needs and the particular questions of that student? Follow-up is worth 10%, and that's about what happens after the inquiry's been answered. So does the institution get back in touch with any further communications? And we look at a 2-week period following the inquiry, the initial response to the inquiry. The final criteria, this orange section here, is impact, and that relates to, it's more of a subjective assessment that's done by our mystery shoppers. And they've all been international students or are currently international students or domestic students, some of them in the UK. And what we ask them is, based on the experience that you've had, how do you feel and how likely would you be to continue engaging with that institution? And so this criteria was 10% last year, now it's 20%. And that is really trying to answer that so what question. So what was the impact of that in kind of customer service inquiry experience? Oh. Then what we do once we've got all those scores of those inquiries, so as an institution, you'll have had 6 or in some cases 24 inquiries placed. They get the scores of each of those get averaged together, and that makes your institution score. Then what we do is we will grab all the institutions, for example, all the UK ones, then we can average that and it creates a UK average. And we do that for each region of the world. So in this report, it's going to include 4 regions, ANZ, EMEA, Canada, and UK. And then obviously that all rolls up into a global average. I'm also going to be presenting some results along a sliding scale. And this is a kind of from poor to developing to good to excellent. And this is our range. And so sometimes in your reports, you might see it described that you had excellent results or you were in the developing category. So these relate to these quartiles of the scoring. So that was all the kind of essentials out of the way. Now we're going to have a look at some of the results. So the headline score here is that the global average is 51 out of 100. It's actually the same average score as last year, so there hasn't been a major change. The change that we have seen has been a little bit on the regional front. So the UK's gone up by 1 point. Canada's gone up by a couple of points, 3, I believe. EMEA is a bit of a new region because we didn't have Middle East involved last year. And so we've got a bit of a benchmark here for the first time. And ANZ, fairly stable. I think we've gone down a point, so 55. Now, they're not got great scores here. And what we're really seeing is that the average institution is sitting in the good range, just sitting in the good range on our scale. We'll go through and have a look and see what's underneath that. One of the biggest factors overall, and you might see this in your own reports, is when you don't reply to an inquiry. If there's no response, there's nothing to score. And so it's lacking points on a lot of the criteria. So that is, I guess, reflective of what happens in the real world. If you're not replying to a student, you've already, I guess, lost out that opportunity to kind of convert them down the pipeline. This mighty colourful chart here might take you a little minute to have a look at, but what we're seeing here is the range of the scores from the lowest at 9 through to the highest at 81. And so you can see the spread. The colour coding is telling you about the different regions of the world. And the orange section are Australian and New Zealand institutions. So what you can see up in this top right-hand corner here is there's an awful lot of orange. So most of the Australian and New Zealand institutions have done quite well. The highest score in the world was from New Zealand, and that's AUT. What you'll notice as we get down, the green is the UK. So there's a lot of UK centred around the middle range, and down the kind of end here, we're starting to see a little bit more of those blues in EMEA, and some of the Canadian ones are hanging out in this section here. So that's a very general kind of summary. What you can see is really there's institutions from all over the world in all parts of this chart. So there's good practice everywhere, and there's also room to improve everywhere. A little summary around those. Not every year do we have the same institutions involved. So we've done a slice of the data of the institutions that were involved last year and this year. And what we've seen among those is that there has been an improvement. So we've gone up 4 points on average. And to me, that's hugely positive. That probably, hopefully means people are reading the reports and they're making some improvements along the way. In some parts of the world, we look at New Zealand, we look at Scotland, we look at some of the colleges in Ontario. There have been really marked improvements, and that's wonderful to see. So we're going to have a look at how on average the world did around the different criteria scores. So we got a score of 8 out of 10 for inquiry channels, and that's telling us that universities and colleges are pretty good at having a range of channels available. Websites are working pretty well. Students mostly aren't having any trouble finding what they need to find. And we did see some really nice feedback coming through, verbatim feedback coming through from students about the web design, and they really do notice that stuff, and they appreciate when websites are helping them get what they need to quickly and easily. For responsiveness, the score here is 10 out of 20, so that's not great, and it is because there's a chunk of inquiries. It's the number is 1 in 4, so a quarter of the inquiries don't get a response within the window that we take this survey. So this research looks at, for email, a maximum period of 3 weeks, which is fairly long. Most of the students that I talk to or institutions sort of say, wow, yeah, if you haven't replied within 3 weeks, it's probably kind of dead in the water. And that's the maximum we allow. So the social media and peer-to-peer, we're looking at a 1 week turnaround, and on live chat, up to 15 minutes wait time. So anything beyond that wouldn't be counted. Communication quality, we have 21 out of 40. So definitely hitting all the basics around communication quality. Most replies are clear, they're polite, they contain fairly relevant information, but not many of them are taking that next step to be a really persuasive or welcoming communication, not sort of sharing extra content that's going to inspire a student or answer the question they didn't ask. So there's definitely room to improve there. Follow-up was the weakest area. So we've got a score of 2 out of 10 for follow-up. And that is really because a lot of institutions aren't following up, not within the 2-week period that we're analysing for this research. And what we found is that there's some institutions worldwide, I've got the number here somewhere, and there's a certain number that don't reply or don't follow up at all. So that no matter what channel, no matter what student, there is no follow-up that happens. So it's probably a lack of systems, or just having kicked off that idea of lead nurturing within their institution. For impact, we've got a score of 10 out of 20, and that's really telling you that students are kind of pretty evenly divided, sitting on either side of the fence. About half are having a good experience and about half are not. What was really interesting, though, I think all institutions some day of the week you're going to let somebody down, that you can't be perfect all of the time, and so it's probably unrealistic to expect that you're going to get a perfect score for impact on every single student every single time. The interesting thing, though, was that there was a chunk of institutions, so about 40% of those that were in this research this year, and they got a negative rating from more than half of the mystery shoppers. So that's really telling us something, that there's a group there that you're kind of consistently having a bad experience, whereas the other ones might have just been one out of the mystery shoppers was put off by something, but the majority were having a good time. But for 40% of the institutions, it's sort of detecting a bit of a pattern and a problem, and that's been called out in the reports. If that is you, don't worry. It's good to know the feedback, and then at least you can take some action. And hopefully the recommendations that are in your report give you a good place to start. So we've got now here a breakdown on the scores by the different types of personas. So what we can see here is that we've got email, inquiry form, and email up here performing quite well. So we're getting 55, 56. They're good, getting up towards fairly consistent scores, and they, across all the different countries it looked at, they were performing well. Also, this live chat here for Vietnam was only, this type of persona did not inquire to the UK. Instead, the UK had a different live chat. We actually saw a bit of a difference between the quality of the live chats between, say, many of the Australian and New Zealand institutions, and the way they were handling international student chats, and many of the Canadians as well, compared to the UK and how they were handling their domestic student chats. And it did seem that those domestic students were not getting as good as an experience. The ones that are in orange are the ones we've highlighted. It's a bit of a concern because they're sort of below 50, so they're sitting in that developing range. So Find a Masters, that's one of those referral type websites. And in some cases there were issues around students not getting replies, but perhaps, and this wouldn't be uncommon in many of the institutions I work with, sometimes those leads or inquiries from external sites maybe aren't seen as good a quality or as high priority as a direct inquiry that's come through the institution's own website. So I think we're starting to see that flow through into the score, where maybe not as much effort or not as quick in terms of the responses to those. The one that's a little bit concerning is Instagram. And so we've got an average score of 45 out of 100. And that's out of 117 institutions. Not all of the ones in the study had Instagram. But what we did notice, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more, is that quite often, I'd say around maybe up to half of the responses that came back were very short and sharp and were redirecting students to another channel. So thanks for your inquiry. Could you please email international at blah, blah, blah. So instead of actually responding to the inquiry there within the channel, they were just immediately redirecting the student onto something else. Now, that's a really bad experience. It didn't happen all the time. There were some great examples of Instagram, but this was a bit of a trend that we noticed, and something, I want to call out. And if you are one of those institutions that has found that that's what's happening, that's why we've got Sara on our call, and she's going to be sharing some tips on what Western Sydney University does and how they manage that channel. One of the other points I'm just going to pull out here is about peer-to-peer. So peer-to-peer has a score of 52. Part of that was the reason why it doesn't look very high is it sometimes was a bit slow, but the quality of the replies that came through peer-to-peer were actually really great a lot of the time. And so I'd say well done to those who have been involved in training student ambassadors and getting them equipped, because some of the responses are fantastic and so authentic and so persuasive simply because they come from the voice of the student. I'd say that's really a channel to watch. I'm going to share this and let you digest it for a moment here. This is going to be sort of on the website, and you can get a copy of the global report tomorrow. We're going to be emailing it out so you can look at it all in more detail. The thing that I want to point out is to say that the #1 country in the world, even though we looked at the ANZ region and showed that a lot of those institutions were doing it really well and were up high there, and they had the highest average as a region, when we drilled down to a country level, Scotland actually was the best overall. So 75% of the Scottish institutions were above world average. And for those New Zealanders on the call, they just pipped New Zealand for top of the list. Another kind of interesting trend, so we've talked about responsiveness. We've talked a little bit about how universities are kind of falling down in that area of persuasiveness. The thing that I would want to point out here is around the tone of emails, so emails or other replies. So we asked the mystery shoppers whether they could trust the information they received. You might think that that's a fairly obvious question, and we're pleased that 90% came back of all those inquiries. They said they could trust. Some of the times they said they couldn't trust the information they received is when it felt too general or too broad. They thought that those answers couldn't possibly be for them, and that they would have to go and check somewhere else to actually get the real answer. So it is there is a little gap there, but mostly doing well. On contrast, only 40% of those ratings came back with students saying they felt that the replies were warm and engaging. So sometimes they rated the replies as polite, polite and professional. They're not sort of rude, but they're definitely not sitting in that really warm, approachable, making you feel really welcome and like you'd be valued as an individual there, just sitting in that more cooler kind of professional zone. There was a very small percent, it was only about 6% that got rated as kind of overly formal or to the point of feeling negative. Majority of communications were just rated as polite. Another interesting point is we saw that 1 in 4 institutions are using some form of outsourcing. So that could be a combination, usually in combination. So they're using outsourcing either some regions, some channels, or some maybe they're splitting domestic and international into different buckets and handling them different ways. One of the interesting things that we saw is we were looking at the correlation of institution scores with the model of inquiry management that was used. So outsourcing on its own didn't necessarily translate to a better or worse result. What seemed to be the strongest correlation is when institutions said they either had fully outsourced or fully centralized. Either or, there was no difference between the two models. So that's sort of suggesting that this idea of having one approach, having all channels run through one team, was definitely creating more consistent and reliable service for students. When we saw institutions having maybe hybrid or multiple different approaches in place, faculty's doing some, offshore rep doing some, central team doing a bit of that, this sort of variety, getting a lot of different outcomes for students and not necessarily that same quality. So just something interesting. It's the first time we've been able to match up scores with the type of model. The other little interesting point is that as part of the survey, we ask institutions what inquiry channels they offer. And 1 in 3 or a third of institutions have now started saying, well, we do take inquiries through WhatsApp or mobile, some other mobile channels. So the UK, it was about half of the institutions there are saying that they offer this channel. This is definitely one to watch. If you're not experimenting in this area, it could be one to get started on. I think we will look at bringing this into either next year or the years after research and see how that's actually going, what kind of service that's delivering for students. I'm going to jump on and go through the different criteria results here. And what we can see is some sliders. You'll have similar sliders in your own reports. These are broken up by region, and the bottom one has got the global. The line is showing you the range of results, so what the lowest score was to the highest score, and the dot here is showing you the average. So what we can see about inquiry channels is that most averaging around this 8 out of 10 mark. Canada slightly behind, and that average is pulled down because there's a few institutions there that weren't offering the breadth of channels that we saw in other parts of the world. UK actually, doing really well because a lot of those institutions, peer-to-peer, I think it's something like 90% of the institutions are using peer-to-peer. In ANZ and UK, live chat's really, really well kind of served by universities, whereas it's a bit more variety in other countries. And there wasn't really a huge change on that from year to year. In terms of responsiveness, this is starting to get a bit more mixed. What we can see is that ANZ and Canada were a bit faster and a bit more reliable. UK was bang on average, and EMEA was less than the average. And Canada has actually improved on this since last year. So overall, it was 3 in 4 inquiries got a reply, and so 1 in 4 wasn't. Email and inquiry channels were the most reliable, so about 80% of inquiries through those channels did get a response. And Instagram had the lowest response rate of all. So a third of those didn't get a reply at all. And as I said, a large quadrant went on to just direct students to another channel. An interesting finding is that New Zealand universities on average were actually the fastest responders, but in the UK, those Russell Group universities, so those very prestigious ones, were the slowest, but they were actually had the highest proportion that actually got replied to. So you might have had to wait a very long time to get a reply, but with those institutions, you were very likely still to get one, even if it came on the last day of the 3-week waiting period. But well done, New Zealand, for being very responsive. Looking at communication quality, we're seeing a little bit of variation here. ANZ leading the way again, and has improved a point since last year. Under communication quality, we notice a few different things. So, as I mentioned before, that thing around containing persuasive content or inspirational content is a bit of a gap for institutions. So they tend to be really focused on translating that factual information, answering the student questions, but most of them, I've got a percentage sum here if I can find that, didn't have that value add. One of the interesting stats was that only half of the responses actually answered all of the questions that were posed by students. So that's probably a quick win, is to actually make sure that you either structuring your inquiry templates to specifically answer the student questions at the beginning before you get into some of that more general information. I think that was one of the things that really correlated to the impact score. students got very frustrated when their questions weren't answered. Moving on to follow-up. So yeah, pretty low results here. We've got Australia and New Zealand doing better, and by better, it's only a 2 out of 10. They are replying, following up on more inquiries. Around for Canada, there was a trend where really we had a huge chunk of the Canadian institutions, I think it was about half, not following up on any inquiries at all. So I think in some ways this could be an interesting question about, you know, institutional culture, and whether that's something we do, or it might be a technology question on whether we have the appropriate technology to support that lead nurture objective. The final criteria is impact. And so all in all, what students are saying is that from many of the Australian and New Zealand universities, they did have a good experience, and they did feel like they would move on and take that next step. In particular, the ones who got the highest ratings tended to be the IRU and ATN universities. They had about 50% of students give that most positive, most positive and most likely rating. Also to be called out is the Scottish universities as well that got that similar rating. I'm going to just move on to a couple of slides here that talk about the resourcing and technology setup. So as part of the survey, we did ask institutions how they were set up. So what we're finding is that, yeah, a lot of institutions are sitting in this bucket, 10,000 to 50,000 international inquiries a year. And, a good chunk, I'd say these ones that are less than 10,000, we did have a few smaller colleges in the survey, and some of the smaller European and Middle Eastern universities fell into this category. When we were looking at these ones here that are sitting in more than 100,000, they tended to be your larger UK and Australian universities sitting in that bucket. Inquiry team setup. The one that's sitting here highest is hybrid, and that is really a combination of all kinds of different bits of these other ones, or where they're using faculty plus central teams. But the most common here, if we're looking at a pure model, is having a centralized team. In that staffing sense, we acknowledge that a lot of these responses, there was comments to say, well, we've ticked this box, but not all of these people work 100% of their time on inquiry. So they might be part of a broader recruitment or marketing, or have some other functional responsibilities. We also asked some questions about technology. So Microsoft Dynamics is the most popular CRM. Marketo was the most popular marketing automation program of those that are using that. We interestingly found that about 10% of those involved in this research don't have a CRM at all. They're using spreadsheets and shared inboxes to manage their inquiries, which is really challenging, because some of those were sitting in the bucket of having up to 50,000 inquiries per year. The majority said they do have a marketing automation platform, but often this was accompanied by a comment to say, well, we have it, but we're not really using it, or we've only got one nurture track activated, or it's only for those ones that fill out this particular web form. It's not being used comprehensively yet. So I think we'll watch this space and see as that continues to improve. This percentage of people who have a marketing automation platform is something that's increased since last year. So tech is coming, and now we've just got to start using it. Before we move on to Sara, I'm just going to go through a couple of pointers that we had around, what's going to take people into that kind of good practice zone. So you'll have your own individual recommendations in your reports. What we have here is some of the most common ones and some of the common themes that we found. So yeah, offering peer-to-peer as a channel is a really great thing. It rates well with students, and it can be very very persuasive and authentic way for students to get information about your institution. So recommend looking into that type of channel if you don't have it. Checking in on social media, and we will go and talk to Sara in a second about this. So how to bring that to be more part of your inquiry team or inquiry management processes, and giving people quality replies through that channel. Focusing in on student questions. Try to answer all the questions that a student has asked as directly and as explicitly as you can. That's something that really, really is valued by students and saves them lots of running around and trying to understand things on the website. Include some persuasive content. So a lot of the comms are very factual, so really to just even have a standard little block that can be dropped in, and just to give students that sense of why you're different or why they should choose you. And lastly, if you're moving into that lead nurturing space, check that data flow. There must be a ton of different systems that need to work together, and even if there's an element of manual work required, trying to kind of get those systems connected up. It might be a couple of years long roadmap, but any of those data gaps really mean that students are going to be leaking out of the funnel, and they're not going to be able to benefit from those ongoing communications, events, invitations, things that you might be wanting to let them know about. So that's some tips from us. This is just a little bit of a leaderboard. So we do awards every year. We've just got best in region. We've also got best responses through particular channels, and we've also got some awards for most improved and the student favourite. That relates to that impact criteria that we looked at. So as you'll see here, Western Sydney University has the best Instagram experience globally. I'm going to take a little pause here, and I'm going to invite Sara to come and join me.
Hello.
Hello. Can we make Sara? We need to spotlight her. Here we go. All right. There we are. Thanks for joining us, Sara. I've just got a couple of questions for you, and thank you for being generous in sharing, well, I can say your world-leading expertise on social media inquiries now that you've, won this very prestigious award. So, look, many of the institutions that we looked at seem to have a bit of a fragmented approach to their inquiry management, different channels being managed in different ways. How do you do it at Western Sydney?
Yeah, so with our social media channels, we have a bit of history in this space and have been doing monitoring and responding for social for many years now. Essentially, that was because our marketing team had one social media manager and so needed support, and it made sense for our customer service agents who know a lot about the university, have all that information, the customer service training, and so they are really well equipped to respond. So it's just purely due to the knowledge in the team and the customer service required that we kind of ended up taking that role up. We use Hootsuite at the moment, so it's not our main contact center system that we use. So that is painful. Like, then I think you spoke about that as well in terms of our different systems and getting them up to their full potential there. So that is frustrating. But we do, because of it being a separate platform, it does mean we provide it with a dedicated agent, and due to the public nature of many of the online responses, so if you're monitoring some of our ads or some of the posts, organic posts we're doing, you're putting that out quite publicly. You've got to be really careful about those responses. So very experienced agents do that work. They use the templates that we have in our CRM. So they're largely email templates, and that's probably the one thing I would say about our responses is that they are quite wordy. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily perfect, but it is handy because they are templates that can be used across a variety of channels, and they are centrally located for the agents, which is easy. We do train the team on conversation styles for social. We haven't done that a lot recently, but you can see that they tend to use perhaps more exclamation marks than you would in an email. They're friendlier. They try to make it a bit more personable. Always leave the door open to ask further questions as well. So I do think, though, it's largely similar to our other channels. You know, it needs to be really personalized. You need to make sure, like you just said, you need to make sure you're answering the whole question, not missing any parts or any questions in there. And you're attempting to address or preempt any unasked questions that might help them in the future too. We do employ current students in our team, so they completely get these channels. It's their natural space to be in. I did ask one of our agents about what they do and their approach, because we know that they do such a good job with it, but they have their kind of own little neat templates to kind of top and tail things. They use CRM, but they do try to kind of make it a little bit more casual than we probably do in the email space, probably more similar to web chat. And it's just, you know, making sure they can reply back again, they'll get an answer, the conversation can keep going. So they make sure they're addressing all the questions, but perhaps a bit briefer than what they would do in some of our other channels. And yeah, so yeah, I guess we've had a bit of history in this space, but it's definitely a really important one for us.
Yeah. What do you make of this kind of temptation to redirect students onto another channel that might be a bit more convenient for the university?
I'm seeing this a lot, and I'm seeing it a lot. We're standing up a new call center system at the moment, and there's that temptation for automation, but sometimes when it's kind of, we'll answer one or two questions and then direct you to a different channel, email us, call us. That's not really a great experience. And I've personally seen it when I've been using WhatsApp, for example, as a inquiry channel. And that's really disappointing. You want to have you want to be able to contact through that channel and have your inquiry fully resolved in that channel. And so we're talking about it a lot in terms of what we do with automation, but I definitely think you need to acknowledge the generational shift in channel preferences here. And if you're going to offer up this channel for interactions, it sends the wrong message if they won't be reaching an agent, because you're kind of promoting it in that way. Then you don't reach an agent. And I think you can see from some of our results that our average speed of answer isn't that great for email. So if you're directing them in a channel that feels, while it is asynchronous, you still expect a relatively quick response. And then if you direct them to email, and for us, for example, email is one of our slowest channels to serve. So if we're redirecting them from somewhere that feels that you could get a quite quick answer over to email, that's probably not going to be a great experience either.
Yeah, I totally agree. Apologies if anyone can hear, the rain has just arrived at my house in force, so it's quite stormy. Hopefully it doesn't make a background noise for you all. I just wanted to have one last question, Sara. So you acknowledge the generational shift around channel preferences. So, I mean, have you noticed a shift in volume, perhaps, moving from one channel to another, or are there certain types of students or certain types of questions, or sort of any trends you could point to around Instagram or social channels?
We're getting a lot of international application scholarship inquiries. We're definitely noticing the growing volumes. And one of the things when we first had our setup meeting with you was that we really wanted to see our social media response evaluated, because it's something we haven't evaluated previously. And we can definitely see that growing volume, particularly in the international space. We noticed that some are cold leads, and I suspect that's why some people are going down the way of automation, but it's still really important to provide a consistent level of service. In the Australian market, for example, we're seeing how huge TikTok is. So it has to be a priority from a marketing perspective. So of course, it's going to be a priority in terms of what we can provide from a customer service team as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to just have a little pause there and invite, if anyone here at the session has any questions that you'd like to pose to Sara. She's got to head off in a second, so we're going to take a Q&A in general at the end. But if anyone has a burning question about social media, or I don't know, anything else more broadly, you're welcome to either come off mute or just pop something in the chat.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah, can I ask you, how do you manage the unproductive inquiries?
Not as well as we probably could. I think I think we've traditionally served them quite equally. There's a couple of things we're trying to do at the moment through our outbound calling campaigns and outbound WhatsApp campaigns and everything, and also through inbound as well, is measuring them more accurately if they're a cold, warm, hot lead. So then, while we might have to give a consistent experience to that inquiry by saying, no, we don't have scholarships in that case, or we can't help you with that, and still do that in a good customer service tone, I think it's how we record it in our CRM, and then the dedication from other marketing teams that we work alongside to know whether to invest in that lead or not. So I think that's probably where we're kind of headed to next. It is really tricky from us. I mean, traditionally in our university, the kind of customer service expectations on us to provide. So it's very difficult to think that we're going to ignore certain leads that might look cold, but it's just making sure that agents can respond to them really quickly, and they've got really short templated responses that they can use quite comfortably for those, so that they do give them a response, but it's perhaps not the time invested that you might for someone who looks like a warm or hot lead. And you'll tend to find those conversations become ongoing, and they'll have more questions, and you'll really kind of get to see that as that evolves too. But it is a tricky one. It's definitely one we battle with.
Yeah, so I was just going, how do you cut the conversation really short if you know that they are not worth your time?
I do think you have to be really clear when you don't have scholarships. Is a great example when you really don't have anything available for them.
Yeah. Thanks, Annie. All right. I've got a question in the chat from Pam. Okay. So talking about dedicated agents. So she said, you mentioned you had dedicated agents answering the inquiries from social channels. So by agents, you're meaning your staff members, your customer service agents,
Elissa,
not
would
education.
be easier if I
yeah
clarified. So sorry, hi Sarah. You had mentioned, or you used the words agent, so I'm using your term. So hopefully I'm not suggesting something else, but you did mention that you had dedicated people answering the inquiries from the social channel. So does that mean that the social team and your teams are both accessing the variety of comments and inquiries that come through?
Definitely. So our social media team is quite small. So our kind of customer service agents are largely responsible for the heavy lifting in those channels, including kind of monitoring and tagging what we've got coming through, and then responding to comments on posts, responding to direct messages. Often with the comments on posts, we're kind of redirecting them at times. If it's they need to share personal information, we'll redirect them through and contact them via the messaging option for that social media channel. So yeah, we both are across it, and we can escalate to them if there's something tricky, say a bit of advertising, paid media doesn't land well. We can always redirect to them, ask questions, all those kind of things. So we do work really closely with them, we have a domestic and international teams that look after, are responsible for the various social media channels. So we do work closely with all of them, and that really helps if we need further support. But generally, I think we do a lot of the heavy lifting in those channels.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring myself back on and let you head off. Thank you so much for sharing your advice and being part of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Elissa.
Okay, bye. We'll go on to some general questions in just a second. What I've got prepared for the last little slide here is just a couple of examples. Something we always get asked about is, well, we've seen what we're doing at our institution, but what does good look like, and what could we learn from? So these have been redacted, so they're not, hopefully you can't tell which institution they're from. We do get a lot of good examples that we come across. So this one here is a good one about email. So the first screenshot is an actual reply, and then the second screenshot is a follow-up mail that's come. And so what's really good about this, you can see how the institution has woven in answers to the questions with some of that persuasive content. So here we've got, you know, a link to the articulation arrangements, which is what the student had asked about. And then we're weaving in here about the great opportunities inside and outside the classroom, watching the video. We've got some bonus links at the bottom and a really warm kind of welcome to kind of stay in touch. And then again, moving on to a follow-up email that just seeds some further content, persuasive content about rankings, and then gives some practical ideas of, you know, downloading the guide and scheduling a phone call, for example. So that's a good example of email. Here's another example on social. So this one's on Instagram. So what's really good here is that the student inquired in the middle of the night because they're in a different country, in a different time zone, had an automated reply come back to let them know about the service times. And then when the university had logged on that morning, they replied to it within 2 business hours. And what was really good is they gave, you know, it's really friendly sounding. They are directing students onto specific links and specific teams to get further information, but it's not sort of just bouncing them off to say, ask your question over here. So telling them who they can contact around postgrad student accommodation, telling them who they can contact around industry placements, but also adding in a bonus. Hey, by the way, did you know that there's an online fair you can go to and ask questions of the business team here, which is really, really great. And then last little example here we have around peer-to-peer. So this is a full reply that came back from one of the ambassadors, really, really knowledgeable. They've not just answered the question, they've provided extra content. So talking about, the student had asked around internships and work opportunities. And so they've talked about specific internships available for research in the engineering space, really going through the topics. It's sounding really, they're excited, they're inspiring with the variety of things that are available. They're talking about the benefits of doing some of that, talking up the university's career services, and they weren't able to answer a question about visas. We threw this one in a lot of the times because it is one of those tricky topics that sometimes student ambassadors are not meant to answer. So we're sort of seeing how they handle that. And in this case, they've said that it'd be better to talk to a fellow international student. This one was an EU student, so they didn't need to do a visa. And instead of just bouncing the student out, they've done it really nicely and offered to still be there if they've got any other questions. So there's some good practice out there, maybe something that kind of can inspire you. And then as I just finish, I'll just leave you with a little reminder. So we're going to be opening up registrations well, at the end of this month. So let's say from 31st or the 1st of November, we'll have the registration page open up. We always offer a 10% discount for early birds, so that runs through till the end of December. So if you're thinking of being involved next year, it's a good time to register. And then you'll also be invited to some sessions in the early new year where we're going to be designing which personas, which inquiry channels, what are the inquiries going to be about. So you'd be able to be part of that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then there's a chance for some questions. If you have questions, you're welcome to come off mute or you can pop them into the chat. If you have to head off, that's totally fine. We're going to be having the report published tomorrow on our website. You'll be getting an email with a link to it directly, so you'll be able to just grab it from there. But hopefully this preview presentation has whet your appetite for that. Yeah, thanks for coming. And yeah, questions. I'm happy to hang around for a little bit. I might we might stop the recording, and then anyone who wants to hang around for a chat and any questions, you're welcome to do that. Thanks all for joining.